Good afternoon, and welcome to our next session. Today's session is called Living Ultra Rare, Navigating Diagnosis and Next Steps. I am pleased to introduce Mariah Gillaspie from Lightning and Love Foundation. On our next slide, we will talk about the continuing education credits that we are offering, and these are our continuing education statements. I would direct everyone to the attendee website where you can read this under the CEU tab for more information. And as we've said since the beginning of the talk, we will have the evaluation ready at the end of this session. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Mariah for her talk. Thanks, Mariah.
Thank you, Christy, and hello, everybody. I want to start by thanking Mountain State Regional Genetic Network for having me today. I'm so excited to be a part of this summit. So today I'm talking to you not as a scientist or a genetic counselor. I don't have any letters behind my name. I am just a mom. But over the past 5 years, I have navigated the world of genetics. I've realized just how important participation from us parents really is. I've learned that we are a critical component to moving forward, not only the understanding of our children's genetic picture, but the understanding of genetic diseases as a whole. So today I may be talking to you as a quote unquote just a mom, but I am officially taking back that just because I truly believe that moms, dads, caregivers, patient advocates, we are changing the world of genetics. So my story begins 5 years ago when I gave birth to my sweet daughter, Emma. She was born with a head full of the most beautiful dark hair and perfect APGAR scores. We were blissfully happy, albeit extremely exhausted new parents, at least until about 3 months old, when we noticed her crunching her entire body forward. We thought maybe she's just working on her sitting muscles, but come to think of it, she wasn't making eye contact or reaching for toys either. And then something happened that assured us that there was really something wrong. She turned blue, she stopped breathing, she was having a seizure. After an ambulance ride and an overnight hospital stay with so many scary wires and cords, we were given a diagnosis of infantile spasms and generalized epilepsy. But they weren't able to give us a reason why this was happening. What was that underlying cause? Fast forward 2 years and we welcomed our second daughter, Abby, into the world. She had less hair, a lot more attitude. She's our spunky little girl. But we only had 6 weeks of bliss this time before we saw an all too familiar movement that made our hearts stop. And sure enough, another overnight hospital stay with those same scary wires attached to her head, and doctors let us know that she too had infantile spasms and generalized epilepsy, the exact same thing as her big sister. So it was then that we knew the culprit had to be genetic. This was no coincidence. Genetic conditions present as so many different illnesses, but for families of children receiving diagnoses, many start out just like us. Missed developmental milestones, low muscle tone, seizures. With luck, the genetic condition is established and researched. Doctors can provide an explanation of what is going on within the body to cause the issues. They can give insight into disease progression and maybe even provide a more streamlined treatment plan. But for many of us, there is no discovered genetic condition, or if there is, it's rare or even ultra rare. So where does that leave us? Confused, helpless, just waiting around for science to catch up. So today, I hope to give a parent's perspective and some tips on how I coped living with that awful purgatory of being genetically undiagnosed, how I searched for our genetic diagnosis, and what I did once we discovered it, and once I learned that my 2 daughters are the first and only 2 known people in the world living with their particular genetic condition. So, for parents and caregivers living with disease, the dreaded D-Day or diagnosis day typically stands out as for us being one of the worst days of our lives. And when that follows with no real understanding of what the underlying cause is, we're left coping with not only the disease itself, but the why it's happening. I remember when doctors first told me that my daughter was having seizures, that her brain wasn't functioning properly, that she may never live a quote unquote normal life, but that they didn't know for sure and we would just have to wait and see. I was a puddle of tears in the fetal position on the floor. I remember feeling particularly helpless during a long 3-month hospitalization with Emma in the early days of her disease. I felt extremely alone and completely terrified, not knowing how to help my child. During this time, a few things really helped me cope. The first thing were podcasts. There weren't as many of them back then, but people are starting now to get wise to how helpful storytelling is and how important it is to spread awareness and to prevent feelings of isolation for families living with rare disease. I've listed here some of my favorites. They range from uplifting to commiserating to educational. There's one for every emotion I have felt through the stages of grief and into my desire to take action. And in fact, I listened to one particularly inspiring episode of the Global Genes Rarecast, and I launched my research foundation a month later. Just as helpful to me were some networks that provide targeted support. In those early days, I scoured the internet and stumbled across many different websites offering support and information. I encourage newly diagnosed families to do the same, but I wanted to point out the networks that I landed on that helps me the most. The Courageous Parents Network has many resources. They have a video library covering tons of different topics like transitioning your kiddo to tube feeding, marriage and partnerships after diagnosis, and sibling support. Some self-care videos like writing on healing or on yoga and meditation. When I was just trying to adjust to a world flipped upside down, becoming part of this network and utilizing their resources helped me transition and made me feel less alone. It gave me information on experiences I was navigating that felt foreign and scary. And there are even topics I hold in my back pocket still today, like tracheotomy and bereavement videos, just in case. And of course, there's the old tried and true Facebook. I think I joined every Facebook group for every diagnosis that kept getting thrown at us. Infantile spasms Facebook group, epilepsy, hypotonia, cortical visual impairment, and specifically the one for parents of children with undiagnosed genetic disorders, where I felt comforted being amongst so many living in the gray purgatory of having no genetic diagnosis. And as my post-diagnosis tears slowed and my pain transitioned to a desire to take action, Global Genes and NORD, the National Organization for Rare Disease, were there waiting for me. These two organizations provide so much incredible information for families living with genetic disease. But in our genetically undiagnosed days, these are the two that helped me the most. The Rare Disease Registry aims to, and I'm quoting directly from their website here, build a community of individuals affected by undiagnosed rare diseases, collect relevant data regarding participant demographics, symptoms, and concern and quality of life, information for researchers, clinicians, and regulatory agencies. And Global Genes also has a great webinar called Navigating the Diagnostic Journey that is helpful for anyone just starting their odyssey towards finding a genetic diagnosis. So there I was adjusting to life as a medical mom, not to one, but to 2 children, trying desperately to find a community, to learn all the new things like G-tubes and wheelchairs and insurance red tape and therapies and appointments, and now to jump into the world of genetic testing. NORD has a good webinar called Genetic Testing 101 for people with rare disease. It discusses the different kinds of genetic testing and the pros and cons of the different tests. Like the con, for example, as a geneticist once asked us, of finding out whether or not my husband and I were related. Because our primary symptom was epilepsy, doctors started by running a targeted panel known as epilepsy-causing genes, a panel of known epilepsy-causing genes. This test is fast and cheap, and it limits the data to the genes we know and understand. But when this came back normal, the next step was to run whole exome sequencing on our entire family. At the time they first ran this, it was just my husband, me, and Emma. They had begun the genetic testing process before Abby was born. But this more extensive test looks at all the exons in our DNA. And again, I'm not a scientist, but my rudimentary understanding is that our exons are part of our DNA that code proteins. And proteins are important in telling our body how to function and are the pieces of our DNA that are most likely to cause disease if they're disrupted. So after months and months of anxiously waiting, this test also came back inconclusive for our family. they had found no disruptive genes of pathogenic significance. The next step would be to sequence our entire genome, all of our DNA, including the less useful introns that live between each of our exons. But while this whole genome sequencing test is becoming more understood and cheaper and more readily available, a few years ago when we needed this test, we were denied by insurance. We were simply told by doctors we would have to wait for science to catch up. But as technology rapidly develops, allowing us to more quickly and cheaply map the human genome, and as this whole genome sequencing service becomes available to more undiagnosed patients, allowing us to better understand genes we previously have known nothing about, getting access to this test is extremely important to finding answers. Two organizations that I was able to work with that make it their mission to provide services and time to helping undiagnosed families find their answers are the UDN and the Rare Genomes Project. The Undiagnosed Disease Network, the UDN, is an NIH-funded project on a mission to diagnose the undiagnosed. The application was lengthy and needed a letter from my daughter's doctor, but once approved, they paid for us to jump on a plane to one of their many collaborating universities. We went to Stanford, where they took blood, skin samples, and a full medical history. Many patients, and even some of my friends, have successfully been given genetic diagnoses by participating in this program. And for any undiagnosed family, it's a great place to start in your search for more answers. Another program that we also applied for was the Rare Genomes Project out of MIT and the Broad Institute. Like the UDN, their mission is to help undiagnosed patients find genetic diagnosis. For us, they performed whole genome sequencing on our family for free. First on just Emma, myself, and my husband, and then with added sample from Abby once she was also having seizures. They did this while insurance had denied us previously. And in fact, they did discover our gene, which was verified when insurance finally did agree to pay for whole genome sequencing as soon as Abby came along, making our family more genetically interesting, enough to justify the cost of the test. We continue to work with Rare Genome Project today as they help us navigate anything they can on our diagnostic odyssey. I had to discover these two programs on my own just by Googling. But for any families living undiagnosed, I think access to these programs as soon as possible is helpful in providing hope and in speeding up receiving a diagnosis if one is out there. So through our partnership with Rare Genome Project and with help from our local children's hospital, and because we have two affected children whose DNA could both be used in the analysis of our genetic data, we were able to isolate the pathogenic gene. We finally got our genetic diagnosis, FAP12. It turns out my husband and I each have one broken copy of our FAP12 gene, and we happen to each pass our broken copies down to both of our daughters. Neither Emma nor Abby have any working copies of the FAP12 gene, and therefore they are affected by disease. It also turns out that according to geneticists and the literature, or I guess the lack thereof, Emma and Abby are the only recorded cases of FAP12 genetic disease. They are patients 1 and 2 in the world. So now what? What do we do with this new information? I decided I wanted to fight. I wanted to search for answers, and I wanted to find a cure. First thing I realized is that there is power in numbers. And on my mission to understand and eventually cure this disease, I started my search for additional cases. For any newly discovered genetic condition, building up a patient community can be extremely helpful for things like comparing symptoms and understanding the effects of specific mutations, for raising funds for research, emotional and social support, and for possible future clinical trials for any drug development. I started by turning to the internet, first searching for all variations of our gene name because apparently it has many. I just generally searched on Google and on social media, looking for any mention of the disease being caused by this gene. When I found none, I posted the gene name in a genetic Facebook groups. I started our own FAP12 Facebook group, of which I'm still the only member. And I launched a free bare bones blog with a basic description of our symptoms and our gene name, anything to get the existence of this gene out into the world. From there, I expanded my search into the foreign world of research papers. I would parse through any Google hit that contained THAP12, searching for an indication that this gene was in any way pathogenic to humans. I would stumble through words that I didn't know with my online dictionary open in the next tab. I sent links to our genetic counselor for explanation, and in a few cases, I actually tracked down the email address of the authors on the paper, and I emailed them, noting that the lead researcher is usually the last name listed in the line of authors. With luck, over time, these efforts will lead to information and to additional patients. I'm still hopeful, but for us, we are still the only known patients, and we are having to drive the development towards understanding our gene ourselves. But our last effort to find fellow patients is to submit our gene into something called the Matchmaker Exchange. Matchmaker Exchange is a network of platforms hosted by a group of organizations where new and rare genes can be entered into a database, allowing global search for matches. So for example, the Rare Genome Project could enter a gene into the database through the platform they work with. And if any other organization has entered the same gene into the database through any other platform, they would be notified. The Rare Genome Project did in fact enter our gene into the database, and I was surprised to learn they got a hit. But it turns out we matched with ourselves when another collaborator had entered us into the exchange using a different platform, but at least we know it works. Two of the platforms, MyGene2 and GeneMatcher, allow families themselves to enter their own genetic information into the system, and I encourage any patients with new or rare genes to ensure their information is listed there. So step one was to search for a patient community. Step two is to start building fundamentals of research. Global Genes offers a good crash course called the Fundamentals of Your Genetic Diagnosis that helped me build a foundation of understanding in all things genetic. I learned what it meant to have a recessive genetic condition like ours was. I learned about inheritance patterns of genes. I learned about different mutations like the missense variant or the DNA misspelling that my husband carries and the frame shift variant that I carry. I learned that these kinds of mutations led to loss of function rather than a gain of function. And overall, I learned enough about the basics of genetics to hold a conversation and to communicate on the topic. My next step was to use my rudimentary understanding to parse all existing research papers that I could find. I scoured them for any similar terms like THAP12 loss of function, or for indication of similar symptoms like seizures, developmental delay, and low muscle tone. I also started to read about other genes on the same pathway as ours, genes that may affect or be affected by our gene. For example, almost every research paper I read about THAP12 went on to discuss a pathway, a group of genes, in our case called the protein kinase R pathway, which has actually become one of the targeted areas of our research. In addition to this, I attended Global Genes and NORD conferences like the Global Genes Rare Patient Advocacy Summit, the Global Genes Rare Drug Development Symposium, and the NORD Rare Disease and Orphan Products Breakthrough Summit, all virtual and easily accessible thanks to the changing times of COVID. And it was here that I learned about the importance of animal and cell models. I learned of the International Mouse Phenotyping Consortium's program called Knockout Mouse Project, which aims to create a mouse model for a large number of potentially pathogenic genes. The Rare Genome Project submitted an application on our behalf, which was accepted, and a knockout mouse model began completely free of charge, an incredible resource for any newly discovered genetic disease. I also learned about the National Institute of General Medical Sciences Human Genetic Cell Repository, it's a mouthful, hosted at Coriell Institute. Basically, they will accept blood and skin samples as donations from potentially pathogenic patients and will create cell models called fibroblasts and lymphoblasts free of charge when patients agree to allow their cells to be used in research, which is exactly what we were hoping to do. Since the generation of our cell models, I have had multiple different entities pull them from the repository to be used in different aspects of research. So at that point, I had laid out the fundamentals for research. I had brushed up on my knowledge enough to know what I was talking about most of the time with some experts. I had a basic understanding of the current knowledge base that existed for our gene, and I had animal and cell models in creation, critical components needed for research. And at this point, I hadn't spent a dime. But knowing that while I had accomplished quite a bit without having raised any funds, I knew that real impactful research costs money, and I decided it was time to make things official and to step up our game. I launched our nonprofit research foundation called the Lightning and Love Foundation. It was named this because for us, lightning had struck twice when both of my daughters were diagnosed with the same rare genetic condition. We maintained the love, and that's what motivated us to fight for a cure. For those who are motivated to take it to the next step, NORD has a course called Rare Launch that provides useful information with hands-on training and advice from leading nonprofit experts to help launch a rare disease nonprofit or take an existing one to the next level. And Global Genes has a boot camp called Rare Entrepreneur Boot Camp, designed for patients and advocates who have started funding rare disease research and are looking to better coordinate and build structure around their efforts. 2 additional organizations whose aim is to partner with patients and patient organizations and help them navigate the world of research is first Open Treatments, a nonprofit started by a rare disease dad that utilizes their own software platform to help empower patients, families, or motivated individuals to create a treatment for a disease impacting their loved ones. And the second is Prolara, which provides what they call Cure Sherpas to guide families and research teams through the planning and development to best cure treatment paths that can lead to finding more potential cures for more diseases. So on my mission to find a cure for Em and Abby, there are 3 main categories for genetic treatment options that I focus on. The first is drug repurposing. This is the idea that existing drugs may be useful for new therapeutic targets. Drug repurposing tends to be the first line of attack when looking for a new treatment because it can be quick and much cheaper than other drug discovery processes. There are many technologies and companies that are using artificial intelligence to make educated predictions to identify which novel drug-disease relationships have the highest chance of success. The opposite end of the spectrum, physical high-throughput drug screens can be performed on cell models to observe in the real world which, if any, drugs may affect the phenotype of different genetic makeups. And yet other organizations try to combine the two. We recently started working with a public benefit corporation called RareBase that has launched a platform called Function that aims to look at the gene expression effect from thousands of small molecules and combine that information with a generated mapping of changes in gene expression when diseased genes are suppressed. The overarching point here is that drug repurposing is a thriving and growing field for potential rare disease treatments. And I would encourage young patient organizations to not skip past this option in their desire for a gene editing therapy and for other more on their way towards a gene editing or other more complicated treatment. When I first started learning about genetic treatments, drug repurposing felt small. I wanted the big guns of gene editing, but now I understand that they can all be done as parallel efforts and results can come from, for example, finding a heart medication that stops seizures in one person's particular genetic epilepsy, as was the case for a fellow epilepsy mom that I highly look up to. Next is the antisense oligonucleotide therapies, or ASOs, which aim to alter RNA expression and thereby reduce, restore, or modify protein expression. Maybe you have heard of a little girl named Mila, who was the first in the world to have a drug developed specifically for her. It was the first ever drug developed for just one person. It was an ASO named after her called Milacin. ASOs are also somewhat quick and relatively cheap, and they're an exciting potential treatment option for genetic diseases. Lorem Foundation is an exciting organization that aims to provide free ASOs for ultra-rare genetic patients. They have an application on their website that can be done in partnership with a physician for qualifying genetic specifications. And lastly, the ultimate goal for a cure, a gene therapy. This area is the most complex, the most expensive, the most time-consuming, and can be the most risky, but it's possibly the most exciting. I've listed a few resources that I have found helpful in learning more about this area of research, like the Global Genes Rare Disease Toolkit Guide to Gene Therapy and a genome editing Q&A video for parents and caregivers. But this is an entire topic in itself and one that I am not qualified to give. I continually attend as many other talks on this subject that I can find and read as many articles and research papers that I can understand to continue to learn more about this with hopes that someday I can utilize it for my daughters. So that's where we are. My family's story is still unfolding. We are still in the midst of our journey. We don't yet have a treatment, and I have no idea if any of our efforts will be fruitful. But I do know that I started out as just a mom, but now I'm an expert in my daughter's disease. I run a nonprofit research foundation that is developing mouse models, has generated seizing zebrafish, and is awaiting results for our first repurposed drug screen. I know that without my efforts, nothing would be being done for THAP12 disease, and my daughters wouldn't have hope for potential treatment. And I know that what we are learning through my girls will add to the growing wealth of knowledge around rare disease in general. Maybe our work will allow any future THAP12 patients a life without disease. And I know many other moms, dads, and caregivers who are even farther along in their own fights towards curing their kiddos' rare genetic disease. So to quote one of my heroes, a mom turned neuroscientist, and the woman who I previously mentioned found a heart disease medication that saved her daughter. The largest yet most neglected healthcare resource worldwide is the patient. So I hope I've been able to provide some insight into living undiagnosed and some tips for coping and for continuing the search for a diagnosis. I hope that I provided some resources that can be useful for families motivated to drive research and be the author of their own genetic odyssey, or even to the medical team supporting those families. But most importantly, I hope I have been able to remind any genetically undiagnosed or rare family out there that you are a critical component of the world of genetics, that your voice matters, and that you are making a difference. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mariah, for that amazing presentation on living ultra rare. Thank you for the transparency and honesty in sharing your own family's story, and for the hope that you're sharing with your resources and what you shared today. With that, I just want to invite everyone to put their questions in the Q&A tab in the attendee website so that we can ask them to Mariah. Any of your burning questions you can put in that Q&A tab. I'll start off though by just asking you, I know you and I have had a conversation before about, as we were making the red flags for genetics resource tool, I know this is an area that you're passionate about as well. So you talked a lot about the diagnosis and D-Day, but can you go back just a little bit and share more of those red flags that you saw with your children?
Yeah, absolutely. So with Emma, for example, she spent the first 9 days of her life in the NICU purely for feeding difficulties. And we taught her how to take a bottle while she was simultaneously being NG tube fed. And when we were released from the hospital, she was able to take a bottle well enough to survive, but we were still starting occupational therapy for feeding. And we struggle daily with her eating. And then, as I kind of mentioned, we did not notice her reaching for toys or making eye contact. So all of these were red flags really early on that weren't significant enough to stand out as indicating that there was something underlying going on, but that were concerning. And we had even started looking at taking her to an ophthalmologist, thinking maybe that was the reason she wasn't looking at toys or reaching for toys and things like that. And when she did finally start having seizures, they presented as her crunching her body forward. And our initial doctor visit, they mentioned that she likely had reflux and actually almost sent us home with reflux medication until she turned blue and stopped breathing right in front of them. And so definitely, I think it's something to advocate for, these early signs that while sometimes maybe just slow development for an infant, sometimes can be indicative of something more major going on, and to be kept aware of that and to be aware of the different red flags that could potentially indicate a genetic condition.
Thank you for sharing that. We have a number of comments, so I'm going to just read those to you because I think they're awesome. It says, "Thank you, Mariah. Looks like you just proved you don't need a fancy title or doctoral degree to make an impact. Sounds like Lightning and Love Foundation has already made impressive progress. Looking forward to following what you and Lightning and Love do next. Thank you for your insightful and vulnerable presentation." So thank you. And go ahead.
I said appreciate that. It means a whole lot. Thank you.
And comment number 2, thank you for sharing your story. You're a very special person. And this one's a great one too. Not a question, but a comment. Just wanted to commend you for everything you have done, for going above and beyond being an advocate. Marvel got it all wrong. Moms are superheroes and not some made up man with a cape. You are truly special. So thank you for sharing. Are there any other parts of your journey that you'd like to go into a little bit more detail about that we didn't have time? If you had to rank your resources of the things that were most impactful, maybe is there one that you would really shine a light on if you could bring advocacy to all parents of rare disease children knowing about?
I think, cliche maybe, but just never give up. So much of my journey at the start was literally scouring the internet for email addresses of scientists that maybe studied epilepsy or rare genes or genes on our pathway, and just emailing them, blanket emailing everybody and just asking for help. And what I've learned is that within this community, people really want to help. They want to find answers. So keeping those doors open, making the connections, reaching out, not being scared, and just fighting as hard as you can has, at least in my case, helped us along. There's a lot of luck, but I think that by pushing hard enough, you're opening doors that make it more likely that you'll be lucky in your results. So I am scared to death every day of what I'm doing. I don't know what's going to come of it, but I'm really excited with our progress, and I'm really motivated by this community and all of the wonderful connections I've made. So I just encourage anybody that is looking for answers to look and open the door and keep fighting, because I think you'll have good results.
Going back to that, where you were sharing about reaching out to researchers, just blindly, really cold calling, right? Cold emailing. What was the response that you got? Would most times you get an answer, or were did many go to empty email boxes? Or at least if somebody couldn't help, did they give you another bone of another path that you could go down?
Yeah, so I'd say probably 75% I didn't get responses from, which is understandable. And then a chunk of people responded, "Thank you for sharing your story. I wish you the best of luck. There's nothing I can do." But then there's been contacts where they've made all the difference. They've opened the doors that have gotten us to places where we are actually doing something. I've been in contact with parents who said, "You should reach out to this organization," and they're the ones that are now driving our drug repurposing efforts. I sat in on a conference, just a Global Genes conference, and talked to a researcher there and just asked a bunch of questions, who then got me in contact with his colleague, who then generated our first zebrafish model, initially for free out of the kindness of his heart, and now one of our biggest collaborators. So it really has just been the key to opening the doors and leading us to our successes, but it came with a lot of closed doors and a lot of feeling like we've failed many times and having to pick back up and try again, and then just waiting for that right connection to be made.
I'm glad to hear you had some open doors, even though some of them were closed. I'm glad to hear that an open door can lead to a lot more open doors, and it sounds like that's what's happening. And thank you so much too for sharing about the Gene Matcher program. We had a component of an individual from a component of that on our genetic ambassador call in July. And so I just want to point people to that resource as well, because it's a collaborative of many different programs that form that network. And I think that is an amazing resource for both families, researchers, and clinicians to know about, which I think not so many do. How did you find out about them? Was it just happenstance, or was it your group at the Broad Institute?
My geneticist at our children's hospital actually was the first to enter us. And then when we started working with the Rare Genome Project, they also entered us.
And that's where you matched yourself?
Yeah, exactly. Later down the line, we ended up matching ourselves. And I have put our own information in through the MyGene2, the one that families can contribute to. So again, just putting it out there in as many ways as possible, and glad to know it works. Still waiting for a match that's not just with ourselves.
Right, but great resources. What advice do you have for the clinicians, genetic counselors, geneticists, primary care providers out there when they encounter a family in their office or in their practice? Maybe our genetics professionals encounter it much more maybe than our primary care, but it's feasible that every primary care provider probably has one or two rare families in their midst. So what are some of the things that you might give them advice on helping the families they serve connect with these resources?
Yeah, so I've had some good and bad experiences with the medical team that we work with. Early on, we had an epileptologist that did not really provide any further options past whole exome sequencing. It was kind of that, sorry, nothing we can do, wait for your science to catch up, which for me was not going to happen. And that's when I went out and found Rare Genome Project and the Undiagnosed Disease Network. But I think those should be very quickly given to families as options of next steps. When working with genetic counselors and some of these programs, once we finally did get our gene name, we got the gene name THAP12. And I remember a conversation on a phone call saying, okay, we have the gene name, now how do we fix it? And the genetic counselor kind of giggled and said, well, it's not quite that easy, but never once discouraged me from trying. And I think that is important as well. It may seem like, you're never going to get there, and maybe you won't, likely you won't. But I think I've learned that trying is actually getting you a lot farther than maybe some medical professionals realize. And I have so many fellow moms and dads and caregivers that run their own nonprofits that are doing incredible things and actually finding treatments. So it is possible. So I think my suggestion is just to really encourage patients, if they want to, that it is possible. Obviously, being realistic that there is limitations and it won't be easy. But I think the world of genetics is moving along enough that we can provide hope. And I appreciated those along my path that gave me the hope and the support and the encouragement to keep looking. And all the resources I've listed here were extremely helpful to me. I assume and hope they could be helpful to others. So having some of these in the back pockets for clinicians to pass out to different families is great to have as well.
Yeah, I appreciate you organizing them all in this on your PowerPoint presentation, and we are recording this presentation, so hopefully it will be a great resource. Yes, that great slide.
I did create a couple slides where I've listed everything. So
wonderful.
These are some of the things that really have helped me, again, from emotional, social support into actual resources that we've used within our research that have been great.
Great. And one last question just to wrap us up for today. You mentioned D-Day, Diagnosis Day, and you mentioned professionals along the way giving you hope. We had a talk yesterday by a genetics counselor about delivering difficult news with hope. Can you reflect on maybe how that went for your family, and was that a positive experience, a negative experience, or were there other ways that you would recommend professionals sharing information with families, even if it's ultra rare?
Yeah, when we first got genetic results, because we went through that a few times, it was always, we don't know. There was no answers. And I think that was always hard because you want to have an answer. I think they gave us the news in the best way they knew how. But I think especially years ago, things have moved so quickly. Even years ago, there was not that hope of like, but we're going to keep trying, or we're going to search again. And so I think, again, for me, it was being able to have the hope that we may not know now, but that doesn't mean we're not going to know in the future. So if you aren't getting a genetic understanding, you don't have that genetic diagnosis, encouraging reaching out to places like the UDN or the Rare Genome Projects is really encouraging. And once we did get our genetic diagnosis, I think helping walk through the fundamentals of genetics with a patient so that they really understand is important. Coming down to my level, I know our geneticist was so wonderful and sat with me for like 45 minutes and answered every, for me, dumb question that I had because I wasn't a geneticist, and made me feel very much a part of the process and wanted me to understand to the full extent that I desired to understand. And I think genetics can be so complicated when you're just entering the world, especially for those of us that are not scientists. And having that patience can really make you feel like you're part of the process. And it just helps ease the burden when you're getting that scary news. And then, of course, the encouragement that if you want to go cure your disease, you could try. That was always great too. But that takes it a little bit farther forward.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, and thank you so much for your presentation and all the resources that have helped you, gathering them all in one place and sharing them with us today. We really appreciate it.